Welcome to the MS and Neuroimmune Summit. I am here with my very good friend, Dale Bredesen. Now, Dale and I have known each other for many, many years, and we have a functional medicine approach, in his case to Alzheimer's, in my case to multiple sclerosis, but there's considerable overlap with what we do. Now, let me read Dale's wonderful bio here. He graduated from Caltech, received his MD from Duke. He trained with Nobel laureate Professor Stanley Prusiner and was the founding president of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging. His research led to over 230 published papers, quite a few more than I have, and the first reversal of cognitive decline in patients with Alzheimer's using a precision medicine protocol that really is based on the functional medicine principles that Dale uses and I use in our clinical practices. He's the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers. He's the senior director of the world's first precision medicine program for neurodegenerative diseases, which is in the Pacific Neuroscience Institute. Did I miss anything on your bio, Dale?
No, that's perfect. Thank you, Terry. Always great to talk to you.
So let's talk. First, I really like starting off with a recovery story. You have many that you've seen, people with significant cognitive decline who were able to reverse. Could you give us an example of one of these patients?
Absolutely. And we have a paper, in fact, it's just been posted, so you can actually see the preprint on people who have sustained their improvement, some of them for over a decade. So let me mention Sally as one of many. And she was someone who was a nursing professor when in her 60s she began to have problems. She got to the point she forgot to pick up her granddaughters. She could not put together a gingerbread man anymore. She was struggling just in her everyday activity. So she had pretty significant problems. She then actually got evaluated. She had an amyloid positive PET scan. So her diagnosis was Alzheimer's. And now Alzheimer's is a pathology. So it was her stage of it was the third of 4 stages, which is called MCI, mild cognitive impairment. So she was fairly impaired at that point, but still able to take care of herself. She went on a drug trial. She found, by the way, that she was ApoE4 positive. There are 75 million Americans who have 1 copy of ApoE4, 7 million who have 2 copies. That's the most common genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's. So by all criteria, she had that. She scored a 24 out of 30 on her MoCA test, which means for someone who's a nursing professor, that's significant MCI. She started on treatment that was to remove the amyloid. And with each injection, she actually got worse. Now, to be fair, she wasn't told if she was in the control group or the treatment group, but something clearly was happening. We've heard this story before. She got worse with each injection. After about 8 injections, she said, "This is not working. This is making me worse, not better." She contacted me. We evaluated her, and actually it turned out that she had very significant exposure to mycotoxins, something that is not even recognized at this point by mainstream medicine as being a contributor. But our research over the years showed that anything that decreases energetics, increases inflammation, or increases toxin load can contribute to this network insufficiency that we call Alzheimer's disease. So she went on, just as you said, a functional medicine sort of approach. And we very much came to this from test tube research, which is why I believe in it so much. The research drove us here. She went from 24 to 30, perfect scores on her MoCAs. She's able to pick up her grandkids again. She doesn't forget. She can do gingerbread men. She remembers things. Interestingly, 6 years of doing great. Then she had some problems again. Okay, she was reevaluated. She had gone down on her testing scores. She was reevaluated. It turned out she had 3 new things. Number 1, she had some sleep apnea that hadn't been nearly as bad before. Number 2, she had Cryptococcus laurentii in her sinuses, which is relatively uncommon. And number 3, she had a new leak in her roof with new growth of mold, new exposure to mycotoxins. Those 3 were treated, and interestingly, her scores are now higher than they were even when she was treated the first time. So she's now 7 years doing absolutely great.
Okay, so before we started our interview, you and I were talking about the similarities and the
Yes.
differences between Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis. And for the listeners, when I was first diagnosed in 2000, my neurologist said, "Don't worry, Terry, cognitive decline is not an issue for people with MS." That has since been modified to recognize that cognitive decline can become an issue, and brain fog can become a problem why people end up losing their employment, and that cognitive decline certainly is an issue. So let's talk about what you see as the similarities and the differences between Alzheimer's and MS.
This is such a good point, Terry, because, we tend as physicians and scientists to be in siloed. We're going to study MS or we're going to study Alzheimer's. I actually think you learn more about MS and Alzheimer's by comparing and contrasting the two. So what happens is there are many related pathways, but what's very interesting to me is when you get Alzheimer's, what we see again and again, and these are both what I call deflammatory diseases. There's inflammation, there's degeneration. With MS, it's inflammation, degeneration. With Alzheimer's, it's degeneration is more than inflammation, but they both have both. And why are they different? So what happens is with MS, you actually go through, of course, you've got your innate immune system activation, but now you have your adaptive system. And of course, you have autoantibodies. And of course, things like reactions against both NG-CAM and Epstein-Barr virus, for example, as one example. Whereas with Alzheimer's, these are typically older people, you're not getting the adaptive response. So the problem with Alzheimer's is you have an ongoing, mild, innate response, usually with very little of the adaptive response. Whereas with MS, it tends to be younger people. They have a more brisk, the ability to make an adaptive response. And the problem is that it is a wide adaptive response. In other words, you're not just targeting one thing. You have autoantibodies. So they're two different neuroimmune abnormalities, both leading to degeneration and inflammation.
Okay, so for the listeners, MS, we have a lot more inflammation-driven damage, particularly early on in the disease. But behind all that inflammation is this slow, progressive degeneration that is going on, invisible at first because we have so much inflammatory damage. When we get older, over the age of 45, there's not as much inflammatory damage. Now that progressive degenerative damage is very visible and becomes more and more visible over time. And I think what I heard you, if I'm going to translate correctly, with Alzheimer's, there's not as much inflammation damage in the brain. There's
Right.
this slow, progressive degenerative damage that is accumulating and becomes visible. I see there are some really young cases in their late 40s and 50s, but most often the Alzheimer's is visible, would you say, in the 60s?
It's such a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because when I was training, way, way back in the 1980s, we never saw people in their 40s and 50s with Alzheimer's disease. Now it's one of the most common things we see is a 52-year-old person developing Alzheimer's. So what happens is, and you're right, the disease, Alzheimer's, tends to manifest in terms of symptoms in people in general, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, although as I say, we see a lot of people in their 50s and sometimes even 40s. But what is very clear now from blood tests, from PET scans, from spinal fluid analysis, this disease begins biochemically about 20 years before a diagnosis. And by the way, there's a wonderful paper came out recently in the New England Journal of Medicine from a group in China that followed people, thousands of people, for years and watched who is going to get dementia, who is not going to get dementia. And then they showed that on average, when the changes occurred in the blood, in the spinal fluid, in the PET scans, and showed that, for example, the A beta changes in the spinal fluid were on average 18 years before a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Now with these new tests, p-tau 217 being the most important one, you can actually see in the blood years ahead of time. And I recommend, we all should, I'm getting mine next week, actually. It's just become available. There's one group that's doing a highly sensitive form of p-tau 217 so that we can all avoid dementia. So yes, you're right. It's different ages, but these things start much earlier in life, as you know.
And again, for the listeners with the MS and neuroimmune issues, these degenerative changes are likely happening to us too. And that is why we too are at risk for brain fog, difficulty with our memory, with our recall, and some cognitive decline. Now, what you're doing in your Alzheimer's and what I'm doing in my MS patients is evaluating all of these metabolic pathways, these risk factors, and seeing what people have and then addressing them one by one. And what we see is mental clarity begins to improve, their MoCA scores improve, or their mini mental status scores improve. What I thought might be very helpful for people is to begin to understand what some of these metabolic pathways are that are so important for that risk of degenerative disease and neuroinflammation disease that lead to our cognitive decline.
Yeah, such a good point. And so in the laboratory, 30 years ago, we began by looking at what is the signaling that is involved. And if you look, for example, everyone knows that amyloid accumulates in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's. Well, where does this amyloid stuff come from, and what is it for? And so what it turns out is this is something that is part of your innate immune system that is actually produced by your brain cells mostly, but other cells as well. And it is an antimicrobial peptide. So it is a little bit like when you would put an insect in amber, you are sequestering. So it's a sequestrant and an antimicrobial peptide that will now get rid of things that are invading your brain. So when you have viruses or fungi or things like that, then you actually make this stuff.
So I'm thinking we know it's increased in people with Alzheimer's.
Yes.
Would this be probably increased in people with MS?
It's a great question, and it depends on what kind of insults the brain undergoes. As I mentioned, it's really part of your innate immune system. So what happens is when your adaptive system now gets turned on, that's the more specific part of your immune system. One of its jobs is to turn down your innate system. So, of course, in MS, you have the adaptive system that's more active, whereas in Alzheimer's, it's more the innate system. So for those people who are successfully turning off their innate system, you probably wouldn't see much amyloid. Now, having said that, this new p-tau test, which is positive in Alzheimer's, what they're noticing is something interesting. It's blipping up just a little bit in people with long COVID, as if the people with COVID are actually kind of beginning on a long road that could end up with Alzheimer's. It's
Sure.
certainly possible that you'll see the same thing
And it may be a factor. I was thinking about the people with MS who are having overly active response to EBV or
yes.
herpes that are perhaps contributing to their difficulty. Might those folks have more amyloid?
They may. And again, it depends on
Wait,
how much is the innate
yeah.
response, how much is the adaptive response. And it also depends on type of organism. So here's what's interesting, Terry. When you have response to a neuroimmune response to Alzheimer's, you're making this amyloid. It has a certain profile of insults that it kills. Well, when you have a different group of insults, you make alpha-synuclein. That is a different kind of antimicrobial peptide. And of course, that's what is associated with Parkinson's and
Yes.
associated with Lewy body disease. And then you have other times where you make things like tau. And of course, there are tauopathies without the amyloid, things like corticobasal degeneration and progressive supranuclear palsy. These are diseases where tau, which, by the way, is a third kind of antimicrobial, in this case, protein. So what we've seen in the 20th century as being, here's a pathology that must be causing the disease, has really turned out to be These are responses to various insults, different viruses. You mentioned
Hmm.
EBV, of course, is the classic one for MS. Do you see more MS, for example, after COVID? Because we see exacerbations of
Yeah.
Alzheimer's all the time after COVID.
We certainly see people after COVID having pseudo relapses. They have worsening of their disease, and it takes many more months
Yeah.
from which to recover. And I think we're going to see that there has been another sharp increase in the prevalence of MS after 2020. We'll have another major epi studies that will confirm that, but I expect that we're going to see many more cases of MS. Right now we have 1 million cases of MS here in the U.S. I expect that number to be sharply up. So we've talked a bit about these antimicrobial peptides. Why don't we talk a little bit more about some of those biotoxins that are a big factor for cognitive decline in the Alzheimer's world, and we can draw how they may be a factor for cognitive decline in the MS and neuroimmune world.
Yeah, and I apologize. I want to finish answering your question about signaling because that is a critical piece. So the amyloid comes from its parent, which is amyloid
Yes.
precursor protein. It is a molecule that sits in your neuronal membranes, especially at synapses, and to a lesser extent in other cells. And what's really interesting about it, it's a switch. It will give you one direction, literally connection, when things are good. You have enough hormones, you have enough nutrients, you have low inflammation, low toxicity. It will signal growth and maintenance. You make new synapses. On the other hand, that same molecule, when things are low hormones, low nutrients, low support, low blood flow, low oxygenation, and high inflammation and toxicity, it now switches you from connection to protection. So now you're making amyloid. You're literally trying to fight with this stuff that is coming. And so we see it with insulin resistance. We see it with ongoing inflammation, many chronic pathogens. All these things that change that balance are what give you Alzheimer's, and it allows you to study it, figure out for each person what's causing the problem, and then actually do something about it. Now, you mentioned the toxins. Great point. They are unrecognized in most cases as being critical contributors to Alzheimer's disease. And they come in 3 types. So number 1 is inorganics. There's a lot of work now on air pollution as being one of the most common risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Recent study that identified the 3 top risk factors for Alzheimer's, one of them was air pollution. And so that's key. Also, things like mercury. These are all the inorganics. Then there are organics. So these are things like glyphosate and toluene and benzene and formaldehyde. And these things, again, all assaulting the body. You've got to get rid of them. You metabolize them, you sequester them, you excrete them, et cetera. And you can get overwhelmed by them. And then the third group, and perhaps the most concerning because it's so common, and it also engenders an inflammatory response in addition to the toxicity. These are biotoxins. And so for people who are living in houses full of mold, some people say, gee, I never knew that mold was an issue. Well, unfortunately, the molds are trying to survive. So they are making toxins. We obviously we use penicillin. That was an original one that doesn't really hurt you, but they make things that are gaseous. And it's mainly just 5 types of mold. It's the Stachybotrys, Penicillium, Aspergillus, Chaetomium, Wallemia. Those are the big 5 bad guys. And they are making these toxins, again, to try to survive. They're trying to kill the local bacteria that would otherwise outgrow them. And when they do this, of course, it's damaging us. It's damaging our mitochondria. It's increasing our risk for cognitive decline. It's increasing our risk for inflammation. So many times we hear a whole family, one person will have cognitive changes, one person will have skin allergies, one person will have pulmonary problems, one person will have ADHD, and they're all related to this ongoing exposure.
Okay, so how would a family, and everyone who's listening, the same list of toxins, the air quality, the air pollution, tobacco, it's now recognized for MS to be a huge factor. Mercury, lead, arsenic, cadmium, those are factors for people with MS and neuroimmune issues. And, the same list of organic solvents, toluene, benzene, glyphosate, these are problems for the MS and neuroimmune patient as well. And mold, yes, can be a problem.
Yeah.
Let's sort of walk through why mold might be in your environment and you're not aware that there's mold in your environment.
Yeah, great point. And Dr. Richie Shoemaker, I have to give him a lot of credit for his work over the years, and again, often against the establishment claims. He's turned out to be absolutely right about many things. And one of his points is that when you have water damage in buildings, and this can be in your home, this can be in your place of work, this can be where you're going to work out, whatever. Water damage to buildings allows these mold species to thrive. And again, they're trying to thrive in a tough environment where they're being outcompeted by bacteria. As he points out, they also respond to the fact that we've treated the wood to prevent things like termites. And these things, therefore, are recognizing, there's toxins here. I'm going to respond by putting out my own offensive. And so, unfortunately, they make these things, and they do share plasmids and things like that. So they end up being able to make these very toxic things, trichothecenes, gliotoxin, ochratoxin A, things like that. The good news is we can all get tested for these. We can find out if we have these exposures. We can also find out if we have inflammatory responses to these exposures. And we can get remediation for our homes, and we can actually get detoxification over time. And certainly it takes some time. You got to remove these things slowly. Your body has sequestered them in multiple organs, including bones. One of the common things we see is as people get to a point of starting to be just the beginning of what will ultimately become osteoporosis potentially, they re-release these toxins back into the bloodstream. And so now this is why we believe this is why it's so common to see people in their early 50s, right around the time of menopause, that they are now getting a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease.
Wow, I had not thought about that issue. So I may have sorted out that I had a mold exposure
Yeah,
by seeing a functional medicine practitioner who put me through my detox protocol. I remediated my living environment.
great. Yeah.
I'm doing well. I now am in menopause, so I'm in my 50s, 60s. I'm beginning to get osteopenia. I've not done a great job of protecting my bones. My bones are getting more and more thinned. And during that osteoporosis process, osteopenia, you're telling me that that's and I suppose I could be releasing the lead that had
Yep.
gotten stored in my
Mercury.
bones, the mercury that had gotten stored in my bones. So I could be, so we're probably storing not just biotoxins, but the heavy metals. Would you say the organic compounds, the glyphosate, toluenes, benzenes, would that be getting stored in bone as well?
I don't know. Obviously, those are much more hydrophobic. So my guess is they would be in more hydrophobic environments like liver and things like that. But it's a good point. And actually, Dr. Joe Pizzorno was pointing this out. You go through this about 7-year osteoclastic burst where you're now re-releasing these things. So you really have to be concerned at that time of life. And I would love to ask Joe whether these things are in the bone as well. Again, my guess is these much more hydrophobic compounds are going to be in a more lipid-rich
Lipid
environment as
things.
opposed to the bone.
So probably the big thing I'm thinking would be the heavy metals and those biotoxins in the bones. And so again, to the listener, perhaps the suggestion that we could give them is if you're menopausal and you're going through a cognitive decline, be sure to ask for a toxin evaluation that includes both mold exposures and those heavy metal exposures.
Yeah. And Terry, if I could ask you a question. So one of the things years and years ago, it was pointed out that one of the MS experts came to visit the Buck Institute and pointed out that when you prevent, this was early days of Tesabri, things like that, when
Hmm.
you prevent this migration. You're preventing the production of the MS plaques, and you're preventing the relapsing and remitting attacks, that you're really not changing the continued slow march into
Correct.
some degenerative aspects. What's
What
your take on that? How has that shaken out over
so
the years?
what it looks like we've been able to do is delay the conversion to secondary progressive MS by 5 years.
Okay.
And so that 5 years, really wonderful. And I do tell my patients it's really important to stop the enhancing lesions, to stop the relapses,
Okay.
because we want that to, we don't want you to have the enhancing lesions or the relapses. But unfortunately, my neurology colleagues were not talking about the degeneration. And that was because they didn't have any drugs.
Right.
They weren't doing what you and I knew to do. It's like, this is all about the modifiable lifestyle factors.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is about diet, exercise, stress, and sleep. And then we can also look for the toxic exposures and deal with those. So that more comprehensive, integrative approach that you take to Alzheimer's and I take to MS can slow that degenerative decline.
Fantastic.
Um,
And sorry, go ahead.
the good news in the MS world, when I first started talking about all this stuff in 2009, it was a very threatening message. I got banned and people really attacked me. Now, but
How
we kept
dare you
doing our
tell the truth.
research and kept publishing, this surprisingly positive results that we'd find. And now the idea that diet matters, there's a lot more agreement that diet matters, and we can have a debate as to which is the best diet, but there are many diets that you can consider. That sleep matters, stress management matters, and we've been saying for a long time that exercise is really very important. So when I go to the MS meetings, there is more discussion that diet, that, yep, people are still super excited about the drugs, and I think it's fine to be excited about the drugs, but they're now beginning to say, it's just as important that we talk to people about their wellness behaviors.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any of that in the Alzheimer's world yet?
So it's interesting. There's a little bit in terms of people talking about, well, yes, we should be doing more exercise and some basic things, but there's really been a schism. There's been most of the PR, most of the articles written, most of the op-eds written are all about get an anti-amyloid antibody. Now, this is despite the fact that they don't make you better. That's been well proven. They slow the decline by 27%. So just a little bit of slowing a decline. That's the effect. They cause microhemorrhages in the brain, unfortunately. They cause brain swelling. They've caused a few deaths. They are massively expensive. By the time you pay for all the infusions and the drug and the follow-ups, it's about $50,000 per year, every year. They mostly haven't been covered by Medicare. Even the ones that are covered are partially covered, so you still have a lot of out-of-pocket. So it's really, as they said, we've been looking for the drug. This is not it. This is not a great situation, but there is a huge pharma effort because it's a business side. It's quite a big win for the pharmaceutical companies. So we really haven't gotten to the point where people have said, look, these other things need to go together. We have stressed over the years, the long term is going to be targeted drugs with an overall precision medicine protocol. I look for the day, and that's kind of where we're headed. But so far, it's really been very much of a polarizing situation in neurology.
Well, yeah, I think the MS world may be a little ahead of you guys then. There's
For
still, of
sure.
course, a huge excitement for the drugs. And in the MS world, there are about 20 different drugs that have a varying level of effectiveness for turning off the inflammatory component,
Right.
but none of them do anything for the degenerative component. Zero.
I see.
None.
Okay.
Nothing.
That was the question. Okay.
And so now I'm going to go on to the next question because they're pouring lots of money into trying to find compounds that will improve remyelination.
Yeah.
And have you followed any of that research, Dale?
I really haven't, but we have the same situation in the case of Alzheimer's, not remyelination. It's really a synaptic rebuilding and synaptic reestablishment. And it's about, intranasal trophic factors and stem cells and things like that. But I'd love to hear more about what's
Well,
going on with remyelination.
so in the MS world, we have a bunch of compounds that are super exciting
Hmm.
for mice and rats, and very abysmal for humans.
Hmm.
And I expect that will probably be the same for the synaptic compounds that we develop for Alzheimer's. That we'll be able to find compounds that work really well for rodents and mice and rats, but don't do work very well for people. And part of that is when we get around to doing human studies, we eat what we want, go to bed when we want, exercise or not, have a fight with our spouse or not.
Yeah.
And so there's all these environmental factors that you control in your mouse study, but
Yeah.
we cannot control in human studies. And so I, those compounds may someday be helpful, and they may someday find compounds that are helpful in the Alzheimer's world and in the MS world. And if they ever get them, and you and I get to use them with our precision medicine, we'll have far more success than all of our neurology colleagues who will use just the drug and not address all the environmental factors.
Yeah, I think that to me, this is the big change that medicine must undertake. When I trained in medicine, and I'm sure it was similar when you trained in medicine as well, it was about figure out what the disease is and then write a prescription that's appropriate for that disease. That was it. And the problem as you've pointed out, with functional medicine, you're actually looking at what's causing the problem. Where the drugs, you're trying to go around the problem, and you're trying essentially to trick nature. And so I think we need to be much better at understanding when we perturb any system, the system is out of whack, which is why the person has a disease. We need to bring that system back to normalcy, not try to trick the system into, messing up and into changing. So, like just do as much as you want and, trigger your MS, but you're going to take Ocrevus because we're not going to allow you to have the B cells to respond to it. Okay, well, that works, but it doesn't necessarily work for the long run. And we have the exact same thing in Alzheimer's. You can give, for example, something like Aricept, donepezil, which now will boost up your acetylcholine a little bit. Well, okay, but you're ignoring what's actually causing the problem. And your body is now going to respond by making more of the enzyme that breaks down the acetylcholine, because this has been a response to something going
Mhm.
on in your brain. So again, you're trying to trick Mother Nature, and in the long run, that doesn't work very well.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, again, anyone who's listening, when you come to see Dale, work with one of his trained practitioners, or you're working with me or one of my trained practitioners, you'll come in, you'll have a very detailed history to really understand all these environmental factors. And then you'll probably have a fairly detailed set of diagnostics that you would go through. That'll be guided in part based on this detailed history. And then we can create a plan for how we're going to address what were your unique environmental factors, contributing factors that led to your cognitive decline due to Alzheimer's, or your MS symptoms and cognitive decline, so we can sort out what's going on, or again, any of the other neuroimmune problems that are attacking your cranial nerves, your brain, your spinal cord, or your peripheral nerves. You know,
So,
go ahead,
Terry, I
Dale.
wanted to ask you, so one of the other points that's been made is that when you have a degenerative component in MS, this can be a glutamatergic phenomenon, excitotoxic phenomenon. With Alzheimer's, we see some of that as well, where there is a glutamatergic component. There's excitotoxic component to the degenerative problem. But again, a lot of this is about you've literally changed your signaling, you're switching your resources from connection to protection. You're making these things that are responding to insults. What's your sense about the underlying important biochemistry that is driving the degenerative component as opposed to the inflammatory component? Is this cytokines? Is it what is it that's driving this?
I think it comes down to mitochondrial inefficiency, that the brain doesn't have enough energy
Yeah.
to maintain the myelin, doesn't have enough energy to maintain the synapses. And so we see this progressive and more rapid loss of brain volume, of spinal cords. So, that was my first really big idea was it's the mitochondria that are driving disability.
Yeah.
And so I first focused on supplements for my mitochondria, and that helped a little bit. And I was super grateful. And then when I got into a much deeper understanding with functional medicine, I was still focused on supplements. And then I, understood a little bit more how to look into the issues more comprehensively and address more at the root cause. But mitochondrial dysfunction is certainly a big, big driver.
Yeah.
It's not the only driver.
Yeah. And what is damaging those mitochondria? I mean, certainly I hear all the time, people with MS will say, I just have no energy, which
Well,
makes a lot of sense. But what's
so
driving that?
what's driving that?
Yeah,
Poisons.
I see.
The heavy metals, the biotoxins, the chronic infections, and then terrible nutrition. If you don't have the appropriate minerals, nutrient minerals, magnesium, lipoic acid, creatine, carnitine, that can be a huge problem. And so resuscitating your mitochondria, again, is a multifaceted approach. And, when I investigate what are the root causes, we often see mitochondrial dysfunction as part of the picture. And as we address all of those factors, mitochondrial dysfunction diminishes, oxidative stress diminishes. But usually it's not just one thing. And I'm sure this is what you see. It's usually, rarely is it one thing. It's usually multiple hits to that person's biochemical pathways that we have to address.
And do ketones help in terms of their energy support? Or are
Ketones
they
help a
not
lot.
helpful?
Particularly for people who have cognitive decline, it's very helpful. If people are willing to do a ketogenic diet, it can be very helpful. There are so many folks who have metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, obesity, cognitive decline. All of those people generally do much better on a ketogenic diet. Now, for some, ketogenic diet is too hard, and then we're going to do a paleo diet and perhaps a lower carb version of the paleo diet. If they could do the ketogenic diet and they have metabolic dysfunction, it can be very, 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 very effective.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you.
Well, Dale, this of course is amazing. You and I could chat for hours, and I look forward to the next time we'll be able to be at the same conference together and can in fact sit and chat for a couple hours.
I look forward to it as well. Thank you, Terry. Always great to talk to you.
Well, hang on. So where do people find you so they could learn more about you and your approach for cognitive decline?
Yeah, absolutely. You can either look at drbredesen.com. You can read one of the books, The End of Alzheimer's or The End of Alzheimer's Program, or The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, 3 different books that you can look at there. We actually have another one that's going to come out next year, which is called The Ageless Brain, really looking at how to make our brains do better in terms of their overall aging. You can also go to Facebook, Dr. Dale Bredesen, or X, formerly Twitter, any of those things, Instagram, all of those, to see what we're doing.
That is marvelous. Thank you so much, Dale.
Thank you again, Terry.